Hi, my name is Dana Flightman. I'm the Training and Awareness Specialist at the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, or SPARC, a project of Equitas funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. I'm here today to walk you through the new Stalking, Know It, Name It, Stop It public awareness program, which was updated just a little bit and revamped in 2021. So, of course, I have my handy facilitator guide here, which includes all the speaking notes. Of course, I've gone through it ahead of time and I've highlighted things and written myself notes so that I can be an effective facilitator. And I've also prepared the materials that I want to hand out during the training. So things like the Understanding Stalking brochure that you can order from our website. So my goal here today is to just walk you through this so you can get a sense of what it might look like when you lead it in your community, either online or in person. So with that being said, I'm going to stop my camera share and sort of restart using the facilitator's guide and acting like you are my participants here today at the program. So please enjoy, and I hope it's helpful. Welcome to the program. My name is Dana Flightman. I am the Training and Awareness Specialist at the Stalking Prevention and Awareness and Resource Center. This training was created by the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, or SPARC, the national training provider on stalking for the Office on Violence Against Women. So let's go ahead and get started. So today's program will discuss stalking and violence in detail, with examples and true stories. Please take care of yourself however you need to throughout this event because it can be triggering. So why learn about stalking? This video will help answer that question.
So why take the time to learn about stalking? Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. Stalking is criminal. It is a crime across the United States. That means it's a crime at the federal level, in all 50 states, U.S. territories, tribal lands, and in our military justice system. It might be a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation. A lot of people don't realize that stalking is a crime, and so many victims are left wondering, well, what, should I call the police because somebody rang my doorbell or drove by my house? And the answer is that victims can consider reporting to authorities as well as documenting the stalking. Stalking is traumatic. Many stalking victims experience mental health impacts, including depression, anxiety, insomnia, and social dysfunction. Quite a few also lose time from work, many lose their jobs altogether. And a significant number relocate. In fact, 1 in 7 stalking victims move as a result of their victimization. It's important to hear from stalking victims and survivors in their own words. This survivor said, "I've given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." And finally, stalking is dangerous. Stalking often co-occurs with physical violence, including physical assault, sexual violence, and rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. And yet so often, these early signs of danger are ignored as, oh, it's just texting, it's just ringing the doorbell. In fact, one researcher went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. So what's the good news? The good news is that we have an opportunity, because stalking is one of the few crimes where early intervention can prevent trauma, violence, and even death. When we recognize those early signs, take them seriously, connect victims to resources, and hold offenders accountable, we can keep our communities safe from this prevalent and terrible crime. That's why it's so critical that you learn about stalking and how to know it, name it, and stop it.
All right, so moving along to our first section here, part 1, Know It. So what's going on? At this point in the program, I would hand out 3 different scenarios. Different groups would get different scenarios and give them a few minutes to discuss. Every scenario is 2 pages long. And so what I want to do is give them some time to discuss the questions. These are in the handouts. I'd have them prepared ahead of time, and then bring us back together for them to report out and then do a big picture debrief. So for example, the first scenario is a woman calls, she's hysterical, and also say is, there's a cup of coffee in my car. And so the handout asks participants to consider, does this sound particularly urgent? This, and they'll probably say it doesn't sound like such a big deal, or why is this woman having this kind of reaction? Seems a little intense for what's going on. Then when they flip the page over or go to the next page, depending how you printed the printout, it comes out that the victim says she's here. And it turned out this was an abusive ex-partner who had found her, and she thought she had covered her tracks, did not think this abusive person knew where she was. She leaves to go to work that morning. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with the old nickname for her on it. And the other scenarios with the tuxedo and the lights are all similar scenarios, all taken from actual stalking cases. And the point here is that stalking is very contextual in nature. And so a debrief should include notes like this after you've let folks discuss and report out a little bit. Stalking cases often include stories like these. Many stalkers use specific, personal, and disturbing methods in order to scare their victims. Sometimes it's not clear to victims that a crime occurred. Stalkers know that their victims may sound crazy when they report the stalking, especially if they don't have proof of what happened, and stalkers may use this to their advantage. As you discussed with these scenarios, context is critical in stalking cases. The coffee cup isn't scary until we know the whole story. In most legal statutes, stalking crimes have a reasonable person standard, and the reasonable person standard asks us to consider how any rational person in similar circumstances to the victim might feel. In other words, if a reasonable person would be scared once they understood the context, once they understood the whole story, that could be stalking. Now, this video will explain a little bit more about context in stalking cases.
Context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases, because a lot of times what seems the scariest to a victim or survivor may seem benign or even nice to an outsider. For example, let's say a victim returns to her desk at work and finds roses. She might become very scared, thinking, well, does the stalker know where I live? How did they find me? Maybe the stalker even said something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you. Meanwhile, her coworkers are saying, oh, this is so wonderful, and have no idea why the victim's reacting the way that she is. So if you don't understand why a victim's so afraid, you can simply ask them, why was that scary to you? What message did that send to you? Can you tell me more about that? There are multiple studies that show that victim fear is an excellent predictor of victim danger. In other words, if the victim's afraid, there's probably a good reason. Not all victims of stalking express fear the same way. In fact, some may not express fear at all. Some victims may seem more annoyed, sad, angry, or have no apparent reaction whatsoever. Different people react to trauma differently, and that doesn't mean they're not experiencing fear and/or emotional distress. So to summarize, something may be scary to a victim that doesn't seem scary to an outsider. Stalking behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. And even if a victim isn't outwardly expressing fear, there may still be fear and still may be stalking. Context is key to understanding stalking and gaining the tools to know it, name it, and stop it.
So what is stalking exactly? Well, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. In other words, if what's happening is scary, involves multiple incidents, this is not the first incident that's happened, and it's targeting the same person again, it could be stalking. And stalking is not just frustrating or annoying. It's scary and or causes severe emotional distress. It's important to hear from victims in their own words. And here we have some quotes from stalking victims describing their experiences. Fear is how we differentiate stalking from other crimes like harassment. Harassment generally describes behavior that's irritating, while stalking describes behaviors that cause fear. It can be tricky to identify stalking because, like the video mentioned, some victims may not use language like this. They may seem more annoyed, frustrated, or concerned than scared. One way to help figure out how scary and or distressed someone is to take note of what they've changed in their lives. People experiencing stalking may make big and small changes in their lives to avoid that stalker. For example, they may withdraw from social activities, change their routines, avoid being alone, change their phone numbers or social media accounts, or even relocate. There may also be differences in someone's health. They may change their eating or sleeping habits or increase alcohol or drug use. All of these could be signs that this person's experiencing stalking. Stalking is directed at a specific individual, not a random person. So stalkers may target other people close to the primary victim, like family members or a new boyfriend or girlfriend. A stalker may use other people close to the victim to get to that victim. Some stalkers do target multiple victims, like a couple or members of a sorority or fraternity, but they are targeting a specific person or persons. It is not somebody random. Like domestic violence, stalking is not just one incident. It is a pattern of behavior. So how many times does something have to happen before it's a pattern? Well, in the case of stalking, at least behaviorally, it's 2. Most state laws as well. It's 2 or more behaviors that make up that stalking pattern of behavior. And does the behavior have to be the same every time, like they call every day? Or can they be different? Well, they can be different. Maybe on day 1, they make a phone call. On day 2, they show up in person. On day 3, they hack into an account. And day 4, they're back to that phone call. You know, all of those are stalking behaviors. And so they don't have to only do one thing. They can definitely vary what's happening. When you're looking at your state stalking statute, realize most legal definitions of stalking use the term course of conduct. And this is a synonym for pattern of behavior. So you might hear me use those terms interchangeably. And many different behaviors can be part of a stalking pattern of behavior or course of conduct. Some stalking behaviors are criminal on their own, like property damage. Others are not crimes on their own, for example, sending gifts, but they can become criminal when part of a stalking course of conduct. Oops. Many different behaviors can be part of a stalking pattern of behavior or course of conduct. Some stalking behaviors are crimes on their own, even if nothing else goes on, like property damage. Others are not crimes on their own, for example, sending gifts or text messaging, but those acts can become criminal as part of a stalking course of conduct. So now that we know it, we'll move on to the next section, name it. Stalking could include a wide variety of behaviors, and those behaviors can happen through technology, in person, or some combination of both. And these categories listed here can overlap and build on each other. Most stalking behaviors fall under one of these categories. So surveillance includes watching, tracking, and or gathering information about the victim. Life invasion means showing up in the victim's life where the victim does not want that stalker to be there. They're just trying to get through their day, and there's the stalker or signs of the stalker, no matter what they do. Interference includes sabotaging, attacking, humiliating, or otherwise changing the victim's life for the worse. And intimidation means the ways a stalker threatens and or scares the victim. So at this point in the program, ideally, you'll be able to divide folks into small groups and give them each a handout, each group a handout for either surveillance, life invasion, interference, or intimidation. Give them a few minutes to be creative, get in the mind of the stalker for a second, and think about as many kinds of behaviors as they can that fall under those categories. So for example, the surveillance group, they would only be thinking about surveillance tactics, and you'd give them a few minutes to do so, to brainstorm as many as they can. If you don't have time for that, you can also just ask for a few examples here on this slide and then move on to these other examples. So I'm assuming that I gave folks a few minutes, I'm bringing them back, I'm asking them to report out. So I'd say, okay, surveillance group, what did you all come up with? And then I would fill in or add or reinforce whatever they said by going to that slide. So these are a few examples of surveillance behavior that you may have named or may not have named, that following or checking in on the person, watching or waiting the place the person might be, planting or accessing a camera, GPS, or recording device, just keeping track of the person online or their social media activity, researching them, hacking into accounts or monitoring someone's devices, and asking other people about that victim, friends, family, colleagues, classmates, or others. Life invasion, again, that's how is the offender showing up in the victim's life. We most often see that through that constant unwanted contact, right? Messaging, texting, emailing, contacting across platforms, calling the person's phone or phones, including hangups and voicemails, contacting other people close to the victim. So friends, colleagues, supervisors, just showing up either in a public space like the workplace, if that's public, or a gym or a grocery store, as well as in private spaces like the victim's home. Just joining groups or communities that the victim is a part of, like they've acted in the PTA and all of a sudden this offender who's never been interested is showing up for meetings. They might leave gifts, packages, or notes for the victim, or spread rumors or misinformation. And those are all examples of ways that they're invading this person's life. Interference is similar to life invasion, but it's really what is the victim losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalker's behavior? What's actually changing for that victim? So that could be tampering with accounts. So you just think about all the accounts you have online, and if someone who wanted to interfere with your life got access to them, the kind of damage they could do. We see stalkers do that. Impersonating the victim online, so setting up a fake profile or pretending to be them and sending an email. Forced confrontations, like they're standing in the apartment hallway so the victim can't leave. Property damage, pretty clear interference, right? They slashed my tire, I can't get to work, that interferes with my day. Again, that's spreading rumors. Public humiliation, ruining reputation can interfere with the victim's ability to have a normal social, professional life. Causing trauma, mentally and or physical injury that the victim needs to spend time and resources to address. And custody interference. These are all examples of interference. And last but not least, intimidation. I think you can see that contextually just about all those behaviors could be intimidating, but we do see those threats as well. It could be verbal, written, and or online threats to hurt, embarrass, or otherwise cause harm. It's not always the threat of physical harm. It might be threats to release a photo they don't want released or to damage their reputation in some way. We do get direct and explicit threats, those I will hurt you, or indirect implicit threats, like remember when you told me that secret. They might send third parties to watch the person or intimidate them, so sending someone in their family, for example, to check in on the victim. Symbolic violence, like a scary or threatening gesture, or a crushed soda can, or property damage can be quite intimidating. Blackmail, threats to hurt oneself, or the victim's loved ones, including roommates, friends, family, or pets. That's really scary for a victim. And those forced confrontations. So you'll see some of these behaviors are listed in more than one category, and that's okay. These categories overlap and intersect, but they can help us expand our thinking beyond just surveillance and recognize that any of these behaviors in any combination could be stalking. An estimated 25 million people have been stalked in the United States over the course of their lifetimes. That's 6 to 7.5 million stalked in every 1 year period. And that's about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men. So stalking is very prevalent. And most known victims of stalking are women. While people of all genders can experience stalking, women are more likely than men to experience it. And the majority of victims identify their stalkers as male. This is true for male victims, female victims, and gender non-conforming victims. Regardless of the sexual orientation of the victim, they are more likely to identify their offender as male. So less than 40% of stalking victims report to law enforcement. Many don't report what they're experiencing. So why do you think this is? At this point, I would see if I could get some responses to the group about why stalking victims may not report. In your notes here, you have a few of the major reasons. One is that minimization. They just don't think what's going on is that big a deal, or they don't want to make a big deal out of it. They want to say something like, I can handle it by myself. I don't want to trouble anyone. They may not recognize what's going on is stalking, and or that stalking is a crime that even could be reported to law enforcement. They may be ashamed. They feel embarrassed, or they think what's occurring is a private matter. They don't want to involve other people or tell other people, or distrust of police for a variety of reasons. They may not believe that law enforcement will respond appropriately. And while this statistic is about law enforcement, we also know that most stalking victims don't access whatever services are available. So if that's HR, if that's the campus Title IX office, most stalking victims are not going to that authority source to report for a lot of the same reasons. So myths about stalking can really keep victims from recognizing when it happens. So here's a screenshot of an image result for the term stalking. So what do you notice about these pictures? And what I notice is that the popular image of a stalker is often this hooded, faceless male stranger. So you get these kind of strangers looking in the alley. And TV shows may also popularize the idea of the secret admirer stalker, right? Like we don't know who it is, but it's some kind of hidden, mysterious figure. And while this can happen, it's pretty rare. The victim knows the perpetrator the vast majority of the time. In popular culture, when we hear stalking, we may think about celebrity stalkers or the strangers like on that slide. But this isn't true most of the time. Again, usually the victim knows the perpetrator and the perpetrator knows the offender. So when people think about stalking, they may be thinking about celebrities and obsessed fans, but in reality, the majority of stalkers are intimate partners, current or former. So stalking may be a method of exerting power and control in an abusive relationship. That can be during the relationship and or after the relationship ends. So that's about half of stalking cases are related to that dating violence or domestic violence. But it's also essential to realize that many stalkers are not intimate partners, right? Particularly for male victims, the stalker is often an acquaintance. So stalking is often categorized under domestic violence, but it's essential to realize that not all stalking is related to domestic violence. And all stalking victims need our help and need our support, whether it's intimate partner related, an acquaintance, a stranger, a family member, or a person of authority, like a supervisor, an academic advisor. So all stalkers can be dangerous, but intimate partner stalkers on average pose the greatest risk to their victims. They're the most likely to threaten them and to harm them. So here I'd want to ask the group, why do you think that is? Why might an intimate partner make for a particularly dangerous stalker? And usually what folks say is really on point, which is that they know the victim the best. They know the victim's schedule, they're part of their social network, they have most access to the victim, like their accounts, and they might even have their passwords. They know the victim well and how best to upset them. They know their schedule, they know where they're gonna go shopping, they know their deepest fears. So between that knowledge and that access, they tend to pose the greatest risk. So if you think this through a little bit, it makes a lot of sense. And also when we're thinking about the risk from other kinds of offenders, you know, the closer that someone is or was to that victim, the more they know about them, the more access they might have, the more dangerous on average they're going to be. So now we're going to learn more about a specific stalking case. So we'll watch the video here, though please note you also have a copy of an article. So if AV is not being your friend that day, or you just prefer that format, participants can also take some time to just read the article, which includes most of the same information, and discuss the questions in small groups, and then we'll come back together to discuss. And so if you are watching the video, make sure that you give the appropriate warning, and that's That included in this video is a very distressing 911 call and a graphic description of a murder. Participants are encouraged to take care of themselves as they see fit. And if you don't think this video is appropriate for your group for whatever reason, feel free to reach out and we can recommend another exercise here. And so again, it can be either read or watched. We're going to go ahead and watch the video here together and then debrief. And this is embedded in the PowerPoint.
It all began in the fall of '98. At the age of 28, my sister Peggy began preparing for medical school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She met and began dating a man named Patrick Kennedy. You know, in the beginning, it seemed like a very fine relationship to me. They were dating, doing dating things, going to movies, but I noticed a switch in Peggy's personality. I just knew something wasn't right with my sister, and I wasn't sure why. Peggy and Patrick's relationship lasted about 3 years altogether. In March of 2002, Peggy cut all ties with him. From that day she left him, he began stalking her. Calling her on her cell phone, begging her to come back, threatening her. He waited outside of her work. He waited outside of her gym, just watching her till it was a sort of a sign to let you know that I'm there and I'm watching her every move.
He wanted her back in his life, and until he did, you know, he was just going to persist with it.
At one point, Peggy had called.
Okay, I'm actually going to restart the video because I'm not totally sure it was capturing the audio. So let's go back. Take two.
It all began in the fall of '98. At the age of 28, my sister Peggy began preparing for medical school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She met and began dating a man named Patrick Kennedy. You know, in the beginning, it seemed like a very fine relationship to me. They were dating, doing dating things, going to movies, but I noticed a switch in Peggy's personality. I just knew something wasn't right with my sister, and I wasn't sure why. Peggy and Patrick's relationship lasted about 3 years altogether. In March of 2002, Peggy cut all ties with him. From that day she left him, he began stalking her. Calling her on her cell phone, begging her to come back, threatening her. He waited outside of her work. He waited outside of her gym, just watching her till it was a sort of a sign to let you know that I'm there and I'm watching her every move.
He wanted her back in his life, and until he did, you know, he was just going to persist with it.
At one point, Peggy had called me in the afternoon and said, "You'll never believe this. Patrick jumped out of the bushes at work with a dozen roses and a wedding ring and asked me to marry him." And Peggy said, "I walked right by him, I got in my car and drove away." Peggy was very, very strong and very determined to shake this man from her life. And the more she ignored him, the angrier he got. Then he progressed to paperwork. He made a really nice 8.5 by 11 flyer with a photo of my sister on it. Wrote all sorts of incredible obscenities about her and put her cell phone number on it and distributed it where she had her nails done, where she had her hair cut, where her gym was, where she worked.
She took the flyer to the police and showed them that, but there was nothing they can do. It was only a flyer.
But I think at that point, you know, we were still thinking that he was just playing a game. We didn't think it would escalate. And then he took greater steps because she wasn't reacting. That June, our family gathered in Orlando, Florida for my brother's wedding. Peggy brought a new man she had begun dating, Mark Sparks. Patrick knew that we would all be in Florida for this wedding. And he had flown to my mother's house in Poland, Ohio, and on her white garage doors with black spray paint, he sprayed "PK is a whore" on the doors. Patrick then returned to Albuquerque to set fire to Mark's house.
I noticed I had about 8 messages on my cell phone, and I knew something was wrong. So I listened to the messages. My neighbor, my mother, the police, the fire department were all calling and saying that my house was on fire. Right away, Peggy knew that Patrick had done this.
Peggy and Mark were going from hotel to hotel because they had nowhere to live because Mark's house was set on fire. We were at the point we didn't want Peggy to call us because we didn't know if he was trying to trace a phone call. We didn't want him to find out Peggy's whereabouts. Peggy, it seemed for a while, was just in hiding.
Everything that Patrick did to Peggy, Peggy went and reported it to the police. She was getting very, very, very agitated with them because nothing was being done to stop this man from harassing her.
Patrick's behavior was escalating and Peggy got a restraining order. She went to the police and filed for stalking charges. The trial was delayed for several months. Nothing was being done.
It was extremely frustrating, and in a time where you're being hunted by somebody and you feel more victimized by going through the system to protect yourself, then what good is it?
And I remember Peggy coming home having a binder of probably 200-300 pages in it of just everything she had documented. Peggy did all the footwork. Peggy did everything. She did everything right, but nobody would help her. Why? I don't know the answer to that.
And at this point, Peggy asked the DA, "Will it take a bullet to my head for you to do something about this?"
With Patrick's behavior escalating, we just felt like, at least temporarily, let's get you out of here. Let's wait for this stalking trial to come up. And by that time, we can determine whether it's safe for you to move back home.
Peggy soon left for Turlock, California to begin a new life. She did everything she could to leave no trace or trail to protect herself. 6 days before her stalking trial was to happen, Patrick found Peggy after months of searching.
So how did this happen? After paying a private investigator for information, Peggy's stalker drove to the Albuquerque airport, checked a handgun and a hunting rifle at the airline counter, and flew to San Jose, California. He retrieved his bag with his weapons, rented a car, and arrived at her neighborhood. He posed as a private investigator, approached a delivery driver who recognized her photo, and gave him her exact address.
He caught up with her on her way out of the house early Saturday morning. He duct taped her hands together, he choked her, and he beat her. He beat her so severely with his gun that her blonde hair turned bright red. Despite all of this, Peggy managed to break free and flee to a neighbor's apartment where she was able to call 911.
911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's already beat me up and taped me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118 is what he does. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break it down. Does he have a gun right now? He already beat my head. If you don't get her, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now. Are they on the way? They're on their way. Quickly, my head is stopping wet with blood. He is in this house. He's going to kill us. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm staying on the line. Oh, my God. How close are they? They're on their way. Patrick, I'm the only one here. He ran. Please. Stop it. Female. Please stop it. I think I see him kill me. Is he, ma'am?
The SWAT team arrived. Peggy told them, "If you open this door, he will kill me."
And the police officer said, let's not talk about that, Peggy. Let's talk about your family. And Peggy had said, tell my mother that I love her. And tell my sister who's pregnant to name the baby after me. And tell my niece, Abby, she will have a guardian angel. And those were Peggy's 3 last requests before she was killed.
I just remember punching a hole in one of my walls, and I just, I started crying, and I just said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry to Peggy, because, at that point you just feel that I failed her, that the whole system failed her. You just feel powerless.
All right, so at this point, you'd want to open it up for discussion from the group. Ideally, folks can discuss this in their own small groups, or you could discuss it all as one big group, depending on the size of your group and the timing. But of course, it's a difficult video to watch, and it's good to give folks, a moment to process that. So the questions here that you'd want to discuss: what stalking behaviors did Patrick use to scare Peggy? Well, he used quite a few behaviors, including some of the most common stalker tactics that we mentioned earlier, like following her, property damage, targeting people close to her, gathering information about her. The second question is asking participants to identify some contextually frightening behaviors. So things that were scary to Peggy, but may have not seemed scary to outsiders. So I think that jumping out of the bushes and proposing is a really good example where if someone just saw that moment, they might think, wow, this lady's really harsh, because they don't know the bigger context. But to Peggy, that was very scary. Why do you think that Peggy's family initially thought he was just playing a game? Well, I think that it's scary and that there's an instinct to minimize it, right? And to hope that it will stop, perhaps a little bit of wishful thinking, as well as just not knowing, hindsight's 20/20. And so it's just another call to take these behaviors seriously before they escalate further, recognizing that they can and they do, and that we don't want that to happen. At what point did Patrick's behavior become scary? Was there one clear moment, or would it be different for different people? And my guess is that your groups will say that it's not clear. There's certainly some moments that are more obvious than others, like the arson, is really scary because we're seeing, wow, this person's violent, etc. But some people may have been afraid right away. For some people, it may have taken a while, and that's normal. And different stalking victims have different reactions to stalker behavior, and fear can attach at any time. And how did the stalking impact Peggy's life and the lives of her loved ones? Well, of course, the stalker eventually took her life, but even before that, disrupted everything from where she got her nails done to where she lived to her ability to call her family. And certainly the loss that her entire family experienced is obvious and devastating. And day to day, they were also living in fear about Patrick approaching them, watching them, showing up at their house, calling them to try to get to Peggy. And so it not only impacted Peggy, but the whole community. So those are some of the points that should come up in your discussion. And then you'd want to do just kind of a general debrief. So I'd say something along the lines of what's here in your script, that thanks so much for having the discussion in your groups. Does anyone have any major reflections they want to share? Peggy's case highlights some common dynamics of stalking cases. He used a wide variety of tactics to scare Peggy. Some were quite contextual in nature, and stalking should not have to rise to this level of violence or murder before we take it seriously. We need to be able to identify stalking behaviors early on and step in to stop it. We all have a role to play in building awareness about stalking, addressing stalking, and supporting the victims and survivors. We have the power to support victims and hold perpetrators accountable. So one thing to consider is to not normalize stalking. The word stalking is often used casually and incorrectly. So you may have heard or said something like, I was stalking you on Facebook, or I was totally stalking you online. When what was happening was not actually stalking. Looking at a friend's photo on social media is not scary, right? If it's not scary or distressing, it's probably not stalking. And hearing this word stalking used incorrectly so often can negatively impact our sense of urgency around this crime. It can lead both victims and offenders, it can lead both victims and responders to minimize the experience and think that stalking is not so bad. We don't want to minimize stalking. And, in our media, stalking is often presented as romantic, funny, and/or sexy, when in reality, stalking is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. So think through the representations of stalking you've seen and don't minimize or downplay stalking. Most victims of stalking talk to their friends or family about the situation before pursuing any sort of professional or legal help. So if a stalking victim talks to you, your response makes a huge difference. And if they feel validated and/or seek help, so we're going to watch this video, which gives us some tips on how to respond to those victims.
Most victims of stalking talk to a friend, family member, or someone else they know and trust first before deciding to seek additional help. That person's response can make a huge difference. If the victim's fears are validated and taken seriously, they're more likely to tell others,
as well as to seek additional help from law enforcement, victim service providers, or other community resources. If someone tells you that they're experiencing stalking, believe them. Many victims blame themselves, so remind them that the stalking is not their fault. Nothing that the victim did or did not do justifies the stalker's behavior. If you see or hear from the stalker, do not share any information about the victim, no matter what the stalker says. Don't just have one conversation, check in with your friend using the communication medium that they prefer. Encourage the victim to make a safety plan and to seek local services to help them do so. If you aren't sure where to start, Victim Connect can help make a referral to local resources. Stalking victims can also complete an assessment at coercivecontrol.org to learn more about the risks in their stalking case. And the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center has some general information about stalking at stalkingawareness.org. Remember, victims are the experts on their own lives and safety. Friends like you can provide the information, options, and support to help them make the right decisions for themselves. Together, we can know it, name it, and stop it. Right, so again, most victims of stalking talk to their friends or family about the situation before pursuing any sort of professional or legal help. In other words, if this is happening to someone you love, they may come to you about it first, and your response makes a huge difference in if they feel validated and seek further help. So if you're in that situation and you're trying to help a friend or loved one, that documentation is really critical. And this can help you and any professionals that you might work with, like law enforcement, victim advocates, mental health, etc., gain a better understanding of everything that's going on. Since stalking can take place across jurisdictions, keeping track of where the event took place. By attending today's training, you took a really important step in learning about stalking. But stalking is a dynamic and complex crime. There's a lot of information. So I encourage you to continue to educate yourself on stalking. Stalking impacts every population and every community. So bring stalking awareness to groups where you have influence. It could be through your workplace, a PTA, a religious group, or any number of other communities that you may be a part of. Educating your community on stalking can make victims more aware of when they're being stalked and more likely to take the threat seriously and seek help. At this point, you'd want to have handouts ready, so let folks know, I'll hand out or I'll email you some resources for you to leave with today. You can also order print brochures like the ones pictured here and posters free of charge for any organizations that you're part of. And today's workshop is scripted and available for free online, so if participants see it and think, hey, I want to do this in my community, they absolutely can do so. That's what it's here for. Spark, oops, what? That's what they're here for. January is National Stalking Awareness Month, and Spark creates ready-to-use resources each January for that month. So visit the Spark website to get involved and spread the word. At this point, I'd want to encourage participants to turn to the person next to them and discuss one thing they can do to help address stalking. So I would allow a couple minutes for discussion, and if time allows, ask some participants to share their commitments. Some things that folks share include, I'm going to make sure that my doctor's office has stalking brochures. I'm going to encourage them to attend a training. They might say, I'm going to stop saying the word stalking casually. I'm not going to say like I was stalking you on Instagram anymore. I'm going to try to change my language. They might say, I'm going to be critical of media that romanticizes stalking. I'm going to write a letter to the editor, or I'm just going to talk about it with my family. So there's a variety of things that they can do to help enhance that response to stalking locally. There are resources and help available if you or someone you know is experiencing stalking. And so this is of free slide where you would probably want to put in your agency's resources or any local resources that you might have. If you're really not sure, then the closest thing we have to a stalking hotline is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. That's at 855-4-VICTIM. So if you're not sure where to refer, I'd refer there. But of course, it's great to have your own local information so that people know about next steps. Spark has more informational resources on stalking. So we provide in-person online training. You can visit the Spark website to learn more. Please note that Spark does not offer services or guidance for victims directly. And you can follow Spark on social media at Follow Us Legally to learn more about stalking year-round. Thanks so much for your attention today. I hope it was informative for you. And thank you for your commitment to ending stalking in your community. All right, so at that point, I would conclude the program. So I'm going to stop my share, start my video again. All right, so we did it. We did the public awareness program. So it'll probably take a bit longer, of course, with your group discussions and all of that. But hopefully we've designed something that's relatively easy to use that you can make your own, but also has plenty of foundational materials and notes. If you have any questions on leading this program or want some help or whatever it might be, please feel free to contact me. You can email me at info@stalkingawareness.org. Thanks so much for bringing this to your community. I know it's all easier said than done and requires a lot of time and commitment and organization. But only when folks like you at the local level are making this happen are we going to change our culture on stalking. So I really appreciate you and all of your efforts. Don't hesitate to reach out, and thanks so much.